Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of What's New in Data. I'm really excited about our guest today. I recently signed up for one of her courses. She's a great thought leader in the data industry. Elena Dyachkova, head of data at Bubble, formerly at Peloton and Spring Health. Elena, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm very excited to be on your podcast.
Of course, of course. Likewise, excited about our conversation today. Elena, first, tell the listeners a bit about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. As John mentioned, I'm the head of data at Bubble currently. Generally, I'm a big fan of product analytics. That's my, I think, still strongest area of expertise. And I built up product analytics teams and processes and culture in my previous two companies from pretty much zero, both at Peloton and at Spring Health. But my general background is actually in economics. I think that actually lends itself pretty well to product analytics because all we talk about is, decision making, rational, irrational. So this like microeconomics and behavioral economics, very close to product analytics, I think. But I started my career in sports. I worked in track and field for the first about 6, 7 years of my career, full time, completely unrelated to data. So to this day, I'm actually a huge fan of track and field. And that's another topic that I can kind of drone on for hours. This year's the Olympics in Paris. So I'm already kind of counting days to the Olympic trials and the Olympics.
Oh yeah, that's one of the fun things on your Twitter. Just I like following you for both your data insights, but also random tidbits on track and field, which is always fun. It's usually a sport I don't follow, so one of those fun niche sports to that I get to keep track of just by following your data insights. How so I wanted to ask you a question. So, you mentioned you have an economics background and you recently taught a course on data, and I thought it was a great course. The one of the main areas you focus on is product analytics. So I'd love to hear, your take on how data teams should approach product analytics.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think as anything in data, the answer is probably it depends, on the size of the company, the product itself, because from product analytics, I think the ROI of it really, really can depend on the stage of the product, the maturity of it, the user base and the nature of the product as well, whether it's the growth, whether it's product-led growth or sales-led growth as well. So it would really vary. But generally, what is product analytics, right? Product analytics is just the ability of the product folks weave in data and insights into their decision making that helps them connect the dots between what's happening with product and their users and what's happening with the business outcomes. That's kind of how I see it, is that really enabling folks to make better decisions. And to do it, you don't necessarily have to be as a data, be called a product analyst. You can be a data analyst who works really closely with the product and focuses on the product data. So kind of semantics aside, as long as you have some data on how the end user is engaging with your product, and that's kind of the entry point to product analytics. There's always something interesting to glean from it, but how much time to spend on it, how much effort, how much sophistication to put into it will then depend on your sample size and how important this is to ultimately the business model. And one fun thing about product analytics, which is, I think, reflected in my approach to my course curriculum as well, is I think it's very one of the areas where you can 80/20 for a pretty long time. You can kind of extract a lot of actionable and powerful insight with like fairly simple methods. So there's, a lot that you can do with just SQL queries and looking at correlations, even before you need to get them to sound like complex data science and machine learning models and all of that good stuff. And that sort of comes at the stage where you're more fine tuning the product. So yeah, I don't know. It's a pretty broad broad answer. I guess maybe the last thing that I would note is product managers usually are the first product analysts, right? When they try to make sense of, what they should be working on next in the roadmap. So also, depending on the company and skill set of product managers, they can also get away pretty long for a pretty long time without involving an analyst. So that's another thing I think, especially in the era of AI and automation, where ChatGPT can automate away lots of PRD writing and all of the more kind of tedious work of a product manager, ability to embrace some of the analytical frameworks, concepts, understanding the data a little bit better is also a huge superpower.
Amazing. I'll drill into one area that you mentioned. We're going to get more into product analytics, as I'm super interested in that. But one thing you just mentioned is using ChatGPT to automate a few, tedious tasks for product managers, even data teams to some extent. And this has been a reoccurring theme on my podcast on what's new in data recently, where data practitioners, data leaders, data educators, thought leaders, everyone's talking about how they're using ChatGPT not to like replace the data engineer, replace the function of a product manager, but just kind of at least take away some of the tedious parts that are just time consuming and error prone. And I'd love to get your take on where you see generative AI generally, which ChatGPT is in the category of helping data teams and data product managers move faster.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I definitely see the product management side of it to be much more efficient and fast. Even though I'm not, officially a data product manager, right? I still have to write some design docs or, RFCs and stuff like that. And there is this app called ChatPRD that Claire Wall created. She is, I think, a CTO or chief product officer at LaunchDarkly at the moment. And I tried it recently to write a design doc for a data initiative, and it worked great. I mean, it wasn't perfect. I still had to go ahead and refine it, but it took away all of my kind of mulling about, hey, which sections how should I organize my information? And it was so much faster to just give it a prompt, hey, we're, trying to create a database for this user research CRM that, my team will need to put together. Here is the context, and then just spat it out. And I was able to quickly edit it and set it away. So that was awesome. I think it really would help with documentation and, summaries, all of that. But
this is chat PRD.
Chat PRD, yeah.
And
yeah.
is this domain specific to data product managers, or is it general across all tech? Okay.
No, yes, general across all tech. But it helped me, even though my document was not even a PRD necessarily. And PRD stands for, I think, product requirements document or something along those lines. It was more of a design doc, but kind of the same general purpose of it, to summarize what we're building and why, what problem is solving, what are some of the things that are not in scope. So it was kind of close enough to still be pretty useful. But yeah, when it comes to data specific things, I'm trying to constantly push myself to actually be more intentional around trying to incorporate it, because I think I'm a little bit of a AI kind of hesitator. I'm afraid of it taking my job, so I'm like, I don't know, I don't like you. But I try to push myself because I think it's definitely important to understand its limitation, where it's useful to actually be able to also kind of coach my team on it and find ways that we can be more efficient. I think coding help is really where it is super helpful, and not necessarily it wouldn't write queries for me, because again, the data quality and the semantics of it will need to know a lot about my database and my kind of business context to be able to do it correctly. But let's say a regex, otherwise I would always have to go into some, web tool that helps me with it, or read documentation. But it does great with regex. It usually doesn't need a ton of context for it. And that's great. Or Python, my Python isn't great. I can do a lot with pandas and more on the data science ML side of things, but less so with vanilla Python. And, I need to write a function that calls API and incorporates some pagination, and it can do it very easily, especially if I tell it which API. It can go and look up documentation and actually do it correctly. And that's great because, some folks on my team, they're more junior, they've never done Python, it can be kind of hard to get started. And now, either ChatGPT or something like Hex Magic, it can be an assistant that kind of help them get started. It is a little bit, I think it's like a little bit of band-aidy because if I'm researching how to write an API call myself on like Stack Overflow and I have to do kind of this trial and error, I'll actually learn it. So next time I would actually be able to do it myself. If I'm relying on ChatGPT, it becomes a crutch where I don't think I will ever learn it. I will always just ask it and it will always do it for me. So it's also a trade-off of, I should probably only upload things that I don't particularly care to learn myself. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about when it comes to more junior folks or even for myself, right? Like, am I just using it as a crutch and I'll actually never get better at certain aspects of the job? So I don't
That's a
know.
great way to think about it, actually, because yeah, you have these tedious tasks that are maybe one-off, ad hoc. You don't want to gain expertise in like some, API spec of a tool you're only using for,
Mhm.
an infrequent job. But on the other hand, you don't want to go to Chat GPT for something that should be like part of your own foundational knowledge or area that you need to go from maybe superficial knowledge to expertise. So, I think, for other data engineers who are listening in, I think that's a great way to break down, when should I use Chat GPT or generative AI to, help assist me with the task versus when I should really get in the weeds of the task myself and, you know, really try to avoid having generative AI do the work for me.
Yeah, yeah. And I've tried some tools that I guess I'll give a couple examples where it's already integrated in the product. One, the example is the Stripe Sigma. So Stripe has this new product where Stripe is a billing vendor,
Mhm.
right? So our company uses it, for example, to charge our customers or their subscriptions. And the Stripe data, if you're trying to like reconcile your internal data with Stripe data, it's always a pain because your numbers in data warehouse will never match exactly what's in the Stripe UI. And they have this new feature Sigma where you can actually query Stripe data in the UI, which is pretty helpful. And it has AI in it where you can ask AI to kind of generate the SQL query for you. And it's like I find it pretty dangerous to be honest, because it's the same thing where it like doesn't have enough business context and it can give results that are just like flat out wrong. And if I don't know it, then it's dangerous. Like if I gave that tool to my stakeholder who is not technical and they just started asking this AI questions and looking at the numbers it spits out, that's just scary to me personally. For myself, it's great because I can actually see the logic of how Stripe calculates certain metrics and I can understand it better. So that one is an interesting interaction I had with it recently. And then another AI interaction that I had recently, Google published, it's in beta now. I think it's only available in the US somewhere in like Google Labs. I can find the link for you later so you can share it as well. You can upload the data set and give it a prompt and it generates a Google Colab notebook in Python that does everything: data cleaning, data analysis. And I was itching to test that with the Spotify data set. I was interviewing Spotify last year and they have this data science take-home assignment that they give everybody. I don't know if they still do it, but at least like 2021, 2022, it was just universal. No matter what data role you're interviewing for, they give you this gigantic 100 megabytes data set with like playlist data with like a very vague prompt of, hey, playlists are very important for Spotify. Analyze this data and figure out how to which product recommendations to make. And I was itching to test this Google new Google Labs AI data analysis on this data set. And I failed miserably. So I'm
Oh,
like, okay, it's not taking my job just yet. So that was also pretty fun. I don't want to bash it because obviously it's in beta and they're trying to improve it. But yeah, it spent 80% of my notebook that it spat out was like, group by this field. Error, this field doesn't exist. Oh, this field doesn't exist. Let's try again. And there's like 15 cells where it does the same thing. I'm like trying to figure out what the name of the column is, like tracks, number of tracks, total tracks for like 5 columns. And then at the end, like it gave you some conclusion that wasn't particularly helpful for solving the problem. So I failed at Take Home at Spotify. AI failed it as well. So we're not hired.
Okay, well, if the AI failed it, then you have a good excuse. And yeah, coming back to the Stripe data, yeah, that's something that, I work with heavily too. And, getting numbers to match from like the source application in your data warehouse is like this, always evolving problem. And even sometimes when you think you got it right, you might find that 2, 3 weeks later, someone might raise their hand and say, oh, wait, this doesn't look exactly right. Or, hey, we haven't seen any new data here for the last, few days. And particularly with Stripe, it can be problematic. I've done some things to solve it there with our stream Stripe reader. And then, internally with our data engineering team, like validation is like this constant effort of, it's almost like a whack-a-mole, right?
Mhm.
Where these like unforeseen things, API changes, schema
Mhm.
changes, you know, there was a flood in some data center somewhere and, our service went down, you know, all types of things can happen. So how can data teams like be proactive and monitor this so that it isn't internal stakeholders telling you that the data looks wrong, but your data team knows first?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. I think we're in the process of, trying to figure this out. So we've had a lot of issues with Stripe data for mostly, again, like something that we have no control over. I've had issues with the Fivetran integration. I've had issues with Stitch integration. We've had some issues in our data model as well, where we weren't, accounting for some edge case or some discount or something along those lines, or like ops teams doing some one-off thing there, manually for a customer, and then we're like, oh, we didn't account for that possibility of this happening. So it's definitely constant, and I don't know. I think creating like good heuristics over time around the expectations of what are some expected or unexpected amounts of variance in key metrics. I think that's ultimately the main thing that's going to help solve it. But I think it takes a lot of time because you need to build this like subject matter expertise on, what are the usual daily movements and different revenue evolutions? What are some events for, I think one part of it is also that, your Stripe integration with your product can break where I don't know, you change something and how the checkout is implemented, and suddenly it's not going through. Right. And I don't think Stripe actually natively provides a great observability for engineers to kind of monitor that type of thing. So some of it is also around like leveraging events to see if you actually have a bug in the product and that's what's breaking your reporting. So it's like a very end-to-end beast that you have to figure out this like heuristics and monitoring from
Yeah.
everything. Like, is it broken in the product? Is my ETL broken? It's just like not ingesting something, which is probably this is easier to build observability around, just like number of rows, updated or number of rows ingested, extracted, and so on. And then your
Yeah.
actual metrics and expected daily deltas.
I always feel like it's the biggest myth that data can just be automated and that, hey, from the business applications, whether it's, Stripe or Salesforce or, internal customer facing applications that have a backend database, oh, we're just going to magically bring that data into our warehouse and the warehouse is going to do all the fun stuff, generate the data models and we'll have these pristine reports that are just perfect all the time. And I've never seen that actually happen with data teams because the engineering is always evolving, the source applications are always changing. Like you mentioned, like there's discounting logic, what happens if there's a dispute over a charge? How
Mhm.
do we represent that in the data model? And so it's like this data teams have to be very flexible and they also have to, build that expectation with the internal stakeholders that, hey, people don't love to hear that, things are constantly fluctuating, but the reality is that it is.
Mhm.
So, and data teams are just a mirror of that change. So I think you're right that having the right observability in place is critical. Coming back to product analytics, so I what are some of the common metrics that, product analytics teams should be looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. I think ultimately going back to the premise of one of the main value props of product analytics is the ability to connect product changes or product, user behaviors in the product to the business outcomes. Ultimately, which metrics are important in the product analytics realm are the ones that help you ladder up to revenue. So whatever metrics they are, they should be leading indicators to revenue, or could be profit, GMV, whatever the actual business metric is, depending on the business model of the company, right? So, and this would depend on, again, the product model, the business model, but generally it is, I'm a big fan of metrics trees, right? So generally, you would think about it by starting with your business metric and sort of like decomposing it to immediate inputs, which usually is just like calculation. So an example could be if we're talking about a B2B SaaS, right? Your main metric is usually, some variation of recurring revenue, MRR, ARR, something along those lines that ultimately breaks down into new revenue, churn revenue, and your revenue evolutions, the expansion and contraction. And then for each one of them, you kind of keep decomposing it going down the tree. So let's say if we're talking about a new revenue, and again, like new revenue is not something that product team owns in silo. This is something that, marketing team contributes to by, helping attract more users, attract the right type of user or lead. Sales team, if it's a sales driven motion, by, finding the leads, closing the leads, doing it better, more effectively. And then product as well. Product experience is important to convert, new website visitors or new app downloads into the paying users, right? So at this level of, new revenue, churn revenue is still not something that's a product metric because it's ultimately co-owned by multiple departments in the company, support team, success team, you know, even beyond just product and marketing and sales. So then, and this is where you make that step towards creating sort of department specific metrics. So specifically for new revenue, what are some key kind of levers that the product team owns that help us create more new customer revenue? So in this case, this would be something along the lines of, converting a new website visitor to a paying user. So it's a flavor of, sign up completion metric or onboarding metric where users is sort of like primed for actually experiencing the value prop of your product. And then some flavor of this like activation metric or aha moment metric where how do we find what percent of users, do something that proves the value of the product to them. So it's sort of like a funnel, a little bit of a funnel for the new revenue. And then for a little bit more complicated for the revenue evolutions, right here, it will depend on, what business model it is. Users paying you for usage? Are they paying you for seats? What are they paying you for? Are they paying you for features? And then what are some kind of typical expected repeat usage patterns of your product? Is it something that, they use daily if it's B2B SaaS, or is it something that you use, once a year, like TurboTax or something along those lines, right? So then you sort of like frame those metrics that would be leading indicators for your revenue evolutions. If it's, talking about the churn revenue, you would look at some repeat usage metric that would depend on what is the expectation of like what's the frequency that the user encounters a problem that your product solves. And then the revenue evolutions, the expansion contraction depends on how you're monetizing them. So if you're monetizing by seats, selling seats, then you would need to track some product metrics around collaboration, how well a new user is kind of like expanding to bring in more seats on board, how well they're actually using this like multi-seat model. What are some indicators that somebody might need another seat as a leading indicator? So here it gets like a little bit less universal, a little bit more dependent on the monetization and the problem that your product solves. So this would be kind of like the top line layer of the metrics. And then from there, you have to get like a bit more opinionated on metrics that are a little bit more specific to the product features. For example, with repeat engagement, right? Then you might need to think about like which are the specific features that are driving this repeat engagement, which ones are more correlated with it. Same for activation. What do you consider to be your activation metric? Is it some threshold of usage? Is it a combination of using multiple features in a given period of time? And then you have to get a bit more specific. And these metrics at that level also tend to be a bit less evergreen as the product experience evolves. You add new features, you remove features, and they might shift a little bit as well.
So, and that was a great summary for a very, complex topic. The main point is it really depends on, your product's industry, whether you're B2B or B2C, whether it's a product that's frequently used or infrequent. Like, let's say if you're like Zillow, right? Your users are mainly coming in when they, want to buy a house, or if they're, just browsing for fun or something. Or you mentioned TurboTax, like annual when people do taxes, or maybe semi-annual when they're just like looking up tax records. And from my perspective, given I work on a data streaming product, I'm looking at, trial conversion aha moment metrics, which is like, hey, are users successfully moving data, right? That's our indicator of like, is this person gonna, raise their hand and ask to pay and buy for the product? And then some sales metrics come into the picture as well. So whereas a B2C product, you expect everyone to just, either they're going to keep engaging and you have an ad-based monetization strategy, or, you're something like one of those services like Spotify where you want someone to just put their credit card number in and you're going to pay like a $10 to $15 monthly subscription. So A, it requires understanding your business deeply, and then B, the actual user integration, the user interactions and the frequency of usage, and then the monetization strategy. So you get into a lot of these specifics in your course, which is super great. I definitely recommend it for everyone. I'm signing up some people from my team to take it. Tell us a bit about your course.
Yeah, definitely. I am generally a huge fan of learning to the point where sometimes I have to stop myself, but I always take courses. Like at any given time, I'm like enrolled in a course. I am right now doing a Reforge course about business metrics, which is a lot of fun. But I've taken a bunch of these courses. When I started product analytics at Peloton, I actually didn't know anything about product analytics, almost nothing about product management. So the way I learned is by taking courses, Reforge courses, and learning about product management, because there was not a product analytics course at that time. More recently, I was taking a bunch of more technical courses on UpLimit, statistics, experimentation, causal inference. And I've been really enjoying it as a student. And as I was doing it, I was also constantly reflecting on, what are some things that, I've had to take so many of these courses to kind of get well-rounded across certain product skills, certain technical skills that come together as making me successful as a product analyst. And how would I, what type of a learning experience would I wanted if I went back to, 2018 and my first days at Peloton to kind of get me where I'm now quicker and more effectively. And I was reflecting on it, and I felt like there was not really necessarily a course that combined together this like product sense and product thinking that is usually taught to product managers or folks trying to become product managers, and specific technical applications that will kind of like take these product skills a bit farther and make them more applicable to a data person. Right. Like at Reforge, I've taken some courses on, let's say, growth strategy, taking some courses on experimentation, and they would give a very good kind of like high level framework for how a product manager would think about it, but they would stop short at, hey, here's the data set, let's try to actually calculate this metric. Here's what statistical significance is, and like actually equip me as a data person to, take it all the way. And if I were to go to a data course, that was kind of the opposite, where it would give me a data set and like a Python notebook, and I would be already expected to know, some Python, to be able to do it, or it would give me a toy data set and teach me SQL or Python with something that's like not even business specific, right? So I was thinking about how to bridge that gap essentially. And my course is a 4-week course on the platform called Up Limit. I run it currently about twice a year. So my next one is going to be at the end of September. And I framed it in a way that tries to bridge that gap without going too deep into the technical specifics, with the premise that folks who are not super technical and they're maybe constrained to spreadsheets and SQL, even like very beginner SQL, they can still take that course and benefit from it fully. Folks who are very technical, they can do some like bonus assignments to practice some of their coding, but they will be mostly benefiting from that kind of subject matter expertise. And I go into metrics in more detail, kind of the spiel that I gave, answered previous question, but more detail with more examples, a bit more structure. I go into the area that I think is generally not very well covered, which is the data collection and the data structure, right? To be able to do the analysis, you have to be very proactive as a product analyst around, how do you want to see that your data. You'll collaborate with engineers and product managers about it. So I cover in detail like the technical stack, the tooling, all of the SaaS tools that are out there, how to approach kind of picking the right stack for yourself. How would you name your events? How would you work with product managers and engineers to define the events? And I also go into experimentation, which obviously, a huge part of product analytics as well, once kind of the company hits a specific volume where it becomes feasible.
And what is that volume?
Depending on who you ask, I don't know. If you ask Ronnie Kohavi, which is, he's one of the thought leaders in this area, he wrote the book that's called The Bible of A/B Testing. It's called Trustworthy Online Control Experiments. I recommend for everybody to read it. It's a great book. And he was asked the same question in a podcast with Lenny Rachitsky. I think his answer was to be very comfortable doing it, it would be in like hundreds of thousands, basically, of users. But I think you can really start drawing some benefit from it if you are in thousands. I think if you're less than thousands, weekly users or weekly visitors, it becomes very difficult just based on the sample size, right? You either will need to be operating with like low confidence, or you would need to be waiting for a very, very long time for a test to become statistically significant. So, sometimes it's just doing kind of observational, kind of just monitoring trends over time and complementing with user research. It can give you enough of a conviction, comparable conviction with, doing a test at like a lower significance level, I think. But yeah, I think the kind of mindset around experimentation, though, is something that is very important for product teams and marketing teams to have, because otherwise it's very easy to fall into the pattern of over-analysis or analysis paralysis, where every single proposed product change, I don't know, you can talk about risks, you can talk about questions, you can do lots of rounds of user research and going in circles and being afraid of it because there are so many risks, right? But as Claire Vaux says, I'm referencing Claire second time in this podcast, as I'm a huge fan, she says fast beats right, generally, right? And the
Yeah,
premise
I
of
agree with
just
that.
like putting something out there, whether it's like an actual experiment, a solid A/B test, or it is, just putting something out there to just see the data, even if it's, an actual just a release, it's usually much more helpful than extending these discussions and let's do more analysis, let's do more user research. I
Yeah,
think these like analysis paralysis should probably be reserved to things that are very, very hard to undo. Something like, I don't know, changing pricing or something along those lines. It's hard to experiment, hard to, make a mistake. It's going to have huge implications. But so the mindset around experimentation, like try to put something out there for the users incrementally and like get some learning from it and then iterate. It's, I think, very valuable.
absolutely. Elena, where can people follow along with your work?
I am on Twitter or X unfortunately, still way too much time. My handle is Elena Runs NYC. And then I have a blog on Substack. It's called Dramatic Analyst. You can just go dramaticanalyst.com. And I have my course on UpLimit. So if you go to UpLimit and search for product analytics, that would be my course.
Excellent. Elena Dyachkova, head of data at Bubble. Thank you so much for joining today's episode of What's New in Data. Learned a lot from you. We'll continue to follow your thought leadership in this area and looking forward to connecting with you again in the future. And thank you to everyone for tuning in.